This regular press briefing already today because we wanted to update you on the outcomes of the meeting of the CHMP yesterday, where our experts discussed, the use of an additional dose of mRNA COVID-19 vaccines and possible booster doses. So I'm delighted to have here with me today my colleagues Dr. Marco Cavalieri, the head of Biological Health Threats and Vaccine Strategy, Dr. Fergus Sweeney, the head of the Clinical Studies and Manufacturing Task Force, and Dr. Georgi Genov, the head of Pharmacovigilance. Initially, Dr. Cavalieri will provide you with an update on the most recent developments, and then we will have about half an hour for questions. As usual, your microphone is disabled for the duration of the briefing and will be opened only for questions. The briefing is broadcast via YouTube and Europe by satellite, and the footage can be used free of charge by all media. And as always, you will find the links in the invite you received. I'm now handing over to EMA's Head of Biological Health Threats and Vaccine Strategy, Dr. Marco Cavalieri. Please go ahead.
Thank you for joining us today for this press briefing. So, firstly, I would like to start by summarizing the recommendation of the EMA's Human Medicine Committee, the CHMP, that gave yesterday for third doses of the two messenger RNA COVID-19 vaccines. The CHMP concluded that third doses of Comirnaty and Spikevax may be given to people with severely weakened immune system aged 12 years or older, at least 28 days after their second dose. The recommendation for both vaccines is based on studies in patients with severely weakened immune system because of use of immunosuppressive drugs after an organ transplant. The Comirnaty study showed that a high proportion of patients were not able to produce antibodies binding the SARS-CoV-2 virus after a second dose, could do so after a third one. And the Spikevax study similarly showed that transplant patients with a third dose of this vaccine had higher level of binding antibodies than patients who had only two doses. Based on the limited amount of data available, the use of a third dose is restricted to severely immunocompromised patients, as there is no clear evidence at the moment that patients with lowest levels of immunocompromise will be benefiting from a third dose as part of their primary vaccination series. Although there is no direct evidence yet from study measuring effectiveness, it is expected that a third dose would increase protection, at least in some of these patients. And the EMA will continue monitoring emerging data that would estimate the effectiveness of the third dose in this population. It is important to distinguish between third doses for people with severely weakened immune system and booster doses for the general population. For the latter, the CHMP has evaluated an application for Comirnaty to add a booster dose to the product information. The application is based on data after a booster dose was given approximately 6 months after the second dose in individuals aged 18 to 55 years of age. The committee concluded that administering a booster dose to people aged 18 years and older at least 6 months after the second dose is safe and provides sharp increase in the amount of elicited antibodies to a much higher level than what was seen just after a second dose. Therefore, it might be considered in the context of the ongoing vaccination campaigns. However, let me say that no firm recommendations can be made at this stage, including when and for whom to implement a booster dose. Such decisions should be based on the available epidemiological and vaccine effectiveness data, taking also into account the limited data on safety that we have for the booster. As you know, currently, myocarditis and pericarditis are the main safety concerns emerging with the use of messenger RNA vaccines, especially after the second dose. It is important to stress that most of the cases of myocarditis reported are mild and self-limiting. It has to be acknowledged, though, that the risk of myocarditis and pericarditis after a third dose has not been characterized so far because it's a very rare event. However, overall, the safety profile seen after the booster dose is reassuring. EMA is currently evaluating an application for the use of a booster dose also for Spikevax, to be given at least 6 months after the second dose in people aged 12 years and older. The CHMP will carry out an accelerated assessment of all the data submitted by the company, including results from an ongoing clinical trial. Based on this review, the CHMP will recommend whether updates to the product information are appropriate, and the EMA, as usual, will communicate the outcome of the assessment in due course. Based on what we know for the time being, when administering in 2 doses, the vaccines offer good protection against severe consequences of COVID, namely hospitalization and death. This is something that we monitor very closely together with our sister agency, the ECDC, so that we can spot trends and update guidance as needed. Emerging data from other parts of the world, including Israel, UK and the United States, would point to some erosion of protection from mild disease, and in the elderly in some studies also from severe disease. Data from European member states will be important to define the optimal vaccination strategies, taking into account differences in the vaccine's use and the interval between the doses. We are aware that some member states have already started administering booster doses. As a reminder, implementation of vaccination campaigns in the European Union remains a prerogative of the public health authorities guiding the vaccination campaign in each member state. Implementation of vaccination strategy at national or subnational level take into account the local conditions, including the epidemiological status, the effectiveness of the vaccination campaigns, and any operational aspects related to the capacity of the national health systems. Let me reiterate that the EMA will continue working closely with national authorities and the ECDC to evaluate all the available evidence and provide recommendations to protect the public during the ongoing pandemic. The annual renewal of conditional marketing authorization for COVID-19 vaccine has been another topic of interest lately. This is a standard process, and it is on track for all the COVID-19 vaccines. As you might have seen, the conditional marketing authorization for Spikevax has been renewed for 1 year by the European Commission based on EMA recommendation. During these renewal procedures, the CHMP reviewed all new data on the quality, safety and effectiveness of the vaccine that emerged between the marketing authorization of Spikevax, which happened on the 6th of January 2021, up to the 5th of June this year. The committee also looked at the data provided by the company in relation to the specific obligation imposed by the CHMP at the time of authorization. These obligations included providing further results from the main trial, which is following up participants for 2 years, and confirming the pharmaceutical quality of the vaccine as the manufacturer was to be scaled up. The committee concluded that the company has complied with the specific obligations that were due, and that these new data have confirmed that the benefits of the vaccine in protecting people against COVID-19 outweigh the risks. A conversion to full marketing authorization will be possible once all the specific obligations have been fulfilled. The status of the clinical trial that led to the initial approval will be rediscussed in the coming months to determine if these additional data are still an essential component of the specific obligations. As for all vaccines, the safety and effectiveness of Spikevax will continue to be monitored as it is used across the European Union through the EU pharmacovigilance system and additional studies by the company and by European authorities. The marketing authorization holders for the other EU-approved COVID-19 vaccines have also submitted their annual renewal application to the EMA in line with the legal requirements, and these assessments are currently ongoing. Once the CHMP issues their opinion, the European Commission will adopt a final legally binding decision. By that time, the information on the respective vaccine on the EMA website will be updated accordingly to reflect this outcome. As this process is already ongoing and underway, there is no concern that any conditional marketing authorization for COVID-19 vaccine will expire in the European Union. EMA and the Member States continuously analyse the report of suspected side effects in order to detect any potential new safety signal. EMA publish also regular safety updates for all authorised vaccines, which provide an overview of how emerging worldwide safety data has been assessed by our safety committee, the PRAC, and the EMA also publishes the main outcome of PRAC's assessment on a regular basis, as we did last week. And to conclude, I would like to mention treatment for COVID-19 patients. We are continuously looking into therapeutics in line with the EU COVID-19 therapeutic strategy and the European Commission objective to authorize new therapeutics by the end of this year. You may have seen our announcement that EMA has started evaluating an application for marketing authorization for the monoclonal antibody Recirona, which is based on Remdesivir, to treat adults with COVID-19 who do not require supplemental oxygen therapy and who are at increased risk of progressing to severe disease. EMA will assess the benefits and risks of Recirona under a reduced timeline and could issue an opinion within 2 months, depending on the robustness of the data submitted and whether further information is required to support the evaluation and the approval. In the meantime, we continue work on rolling reviews for 3 other antiviral monoclonal antibodies products and 3 immunomodulatory agents. As mentioned in our last briefing, the reviews of these compounds are progressing well, and opinions from the CHMP may come at least for some of them in the coming weeks. You can also have a look on our website, where we publish detailed and up-to-date information on EMA's activity in the context of COVID-19, including an overview of all therapeutics and vaccines currently under review and authorized by the EMA. But going back to today's topic, I will hand back to Maria Agnès for your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cavalieri, and we will now open up the floor for questions. If you wish to ask a question, please click on the respective icon at the bottom of the WebEx window to raise your hand. When I give you the floor, please unmute yourself and turn on your camera. You can then ask your question. So today, the first question comes from Helen Collis from Politico. Helen, please go ahead. Helen, we don't hear you. Helen, can you try again?
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Excellent. So looking at the decision this week on the booster doses, the US FDA authorized the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine only for healthy people over 65 and younger people if they're at greater risk of infection. I presume that the EMA and the FDA were both presented with the same data for the booster, and assuming that they both are assessing just the benefit risk of administering a booster dose or third dose. Was there anything in the data that made the EMA consider restricting the Pfizer booster dose to older people or at-risk people specifically? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen. Dr. Cavalieri, please.
Yeah, indeed, we were confronted essentially with the same submission from Pfizer-BioNTech, so the same data with respect to the booster. I think the difference lies in the fact that we felt very difficult to consider the current effectiveness data that are out there at the moment in different parts of the world, and we consider extremely challenging to come up with a granular decision on subpopulation at this point in time with the evidence that we have. So in line with what we normally do with vaccines in general, we tend to give some recommendations that are general, but also in the product information we will be specifying that this is a prudent recommendation, and moreover it will be important to look carefully at the effectiveness data that are emerging from the different European member states when deciding whether it would be good to use the booster at that point in time. So I think that the conclusion on the data are pretty similar, but the implementation in terms of regulatory decision are slightly different because we are working in a much more complex environment in Europe with epidemiological data that might be different across different countries, different use of the vaccines. And we also notice how all these data are evolving very rapidly in terms of continuous update and new evidence. Therefore, we prefer to keep a bit of a broader approach in this sense, just looking at what is the effect of the booster overall, more than entering into what kind of population would be more in need at this point in time.
Thank you very much. So the next question comes from Angelo Di Mambro from Italian news agency ANSA. Angelo, please.
Yes, thank you for the floor. My question is about a medicine that has made the headlines in the last days. Merck has announced that they have this, it is called, it's a long name. Have you received any data and application from this company? What do you think about this news? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Cavalieri.
Yeah, indeed, this is one of those compounds that we are monitoring closely since a while, and I would say it's not the only oral agent under development, but as you rightly said, there are some top-line results that have been communicated by the company, and what I can say is that indeed we will be considering whether starting a rolling review for this compound in the next days. And of course, the idea is to understand if the data would support such rolling review and whether we could come up in a timely manner with an opinion with the use of this product.
Thank you very much. The next question is from Giovanni Del Re from Italian newspaper Avvenire.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
I have a question in particular on the vaccine Janssen from Johnson & Johnson, because there are more and more studies saying that this vaccine has some problems for the monodoses usage. One study was saying just 71% of efficacy against the severe disease, and the company itself, if I'm not wrong, is applied by FDA for a second shot. So many member states in Europe are recommending to use mRNA vaccine as a second dose after Johnson & Johnson vaccination. I was just wondering if you have any kind of assessment on this, if you are assessing the situation, you have some recommendation on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Dr. Cavalieri.
Yeah, we are in contact with the company and try to understand by when there will be a mature clinical data package that could support a potential authorization of a second dose. As you know, also recently they released data from a large safety and efficacy study looking at 2 doses, but with a short interval of 2 months. So we will have also to discuss what could be the interval to be used for the second dose of this vaccine. And again, this is under discussion, and we may decide in the coming weeks what to do with this.
Thank you very much. The next question is from Lorenzo Vendemiale. Lorenzo, the floor is yours.
Hello, do you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay, fine. It's from RAI, Report Rai 3. Talking about the booster for the entire population, when you said maybe considered and you leave the decision to the national agency still so far, it looks like you decided to not decide. We would expect a strict benefit evaluation. Instead, you're just saying to the national agencies, do whatever you believe to do right now. And don't you think that there is the risk that every country goes their own way and there is no more a common vaccination strategy in Europe? Thank you.
Dr. Cavalieri, please.
Yeah, of course we are in dialogue with all the member states, and we know that at least 10 member states have already decided to give booster doses, and also we acknowledge that the recommendations are not always exactly the same. So there is already kind of a different take on the use of the booster. So we will try to align as much as possible with the member states on the use of the booster. But at this point in time, for us, it was extremely challenging to enter into granular discussion on which population should receive the booster or not, because this indeed is normally the type of decision that is taken at the national level or even at the local level. So for us, what we can say now that we see that the benefit risk of the booster is positive. Of course, it would be important that it's used in population for which there is at least least a clear indication that there is a need to give a booster, but we felt extremely challenging for us to enter into more granular definition of this subpopulation, and that's why it's left open. Also, it's important for me to reiterate that this is really a preliminary recommendation, so it's not a strong recommendation as sometimes we do when we really see the need of a booster in the overall population, while here is simply an allowance of using of boosters if deemed appropriate and considering the current pandemic situation.
Thank you very much. The next question comes from, let me just have a look, Alistair Smout from Reuters. Alistair, please.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect. I was just wondering, on the review of the Merck drug, is it possible for you to start the rolling review without being in receipt of an application from the company itself? And just secondly, also similar topic in terms of how you interact with these companies, I'm a bit confused as to how the Pfizer data on boosters has been used to in your considerations. It seems like you've been prioritizing other studies in looking at the immunosuppressed, but is that something you say you want to reflect what's happening in the member states? But obviously the member states would want guidance on your opinion on that Pfizer data as well. So it's just wondering how member states can take their own decisions without your assessment of that data. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Cavalieri again.
Yeah, the rolling reviews for the monoclonal antibodies, this is decided in a process that starts with the early interaction with the developers, with a good understanding of where they are. And when there are at least clinical data that would support proof of concept of the use of such products, then we start the process with appointment of rapporteurs and then decision within the EMA task force whether a rolling review would be warranted. And indeed, taking into account on how promising the agent is. So there is a continuum dialogue, and this is pretty much the decision-making process that has been taking place right from the start of the pandemic on this type of decisions. And of course, the rolling review timetable will have to be agreed with the company and the rapporteurs and the ETF based on when data can be submitted, and therefore what could be the time frame for coming up with a potential authorization. With respect to your second question that links back to what we already stated, essentially we saw that this data from Pfizer is showing that a booster is overall safe and is able to mount a very good immune response with neutralizing antibodies titers that go up threefold or even more than what we've seen after 2 doses. So clearly it's showing that the benefit risk of the booster dose is positive. Then when it's better to use and the timing of using it in different populations, this is something that we cannot say right now in a precise way, and that's why the indication in the project information will say may be given without saying it should or it must. And I think this is an important distinction, but in any case, this will not be the first time that we are confronted with a situation like this, as many times happens that we have booster doses that would show a good booster response in terms of an amnestic response to an additional dose of vaccine, but not necessarily telling us exactly by when to use it. And this will have to be informed by all the effectiveness and epidemiological data that will be emerging.
Thank you very much. Our last question currently comes from Danny Kemp from AFP. Danny, the floor is yours.
Hi, good afternoon. I wanted to ask about boosters. Specifically, I wondered if there's any way of telling how long a third dose might last. At the moment, we're looking at sort of 6 months between the first 2 and a third dose. I just wondered if there's any way of telling, I know you probably don't have the data, but any way of telling, how long a third dose might last, if that's, another 6 months or longer or shorter. Anyway, thanks.
Thanks, Danny. Dr. Cavalieri?
Yeah, I think that we are still struggling how long lasts a second dose, so to say how long will last a booster dose is even more complicated. I think data will tell us, but of course, at least in the context of the booster, what we are seeing, at least with this vaccine, is that the immune response is indeed much higher than what we've seen after the second dose, which means that potentially we will have quite remarkable amount of neutralizing antibodies also for much longer than 6 months. But time will tell, and that's why it's so important that we continue to collect data on the antibody kinetics over time after a booster dose and in different populations, because there might be differences between elderly that face immunosenescence versus younger people.
Thank you very much. We now still have a question from Franciane Intema from NOS. Franciane.
Hi, thank you for having a question. I was wondering, do I understand correctly that the criteria for allowing a booster are different than for allowing the original vaccine? Because, as I understand, the effectiveness has to be proven before you can approve a vaccine, and we know it's protection against severe disease or against death or infection. And do I understand correctly that with the booster we actually only know about antibodies and not about real-life protection?
Thanks, Franciane. Dr. Cavalieri again.
Yeah, indeed. This is what we have been agreeing also with international regulators, that the immune response would be sufficient in order to determine the ability of a booster dose to do what a booster is supposed to do, which is restoring the level of antibodies to what's seen at the beginning or even higher, because indeed, in immunological terms, we see what is called an anamnestic response, in which you have quite a substantial increase of the antibodies with really in a rapid fashion to levels that are normally much higher than what's seen after the completion of the primary series. And this is what we've seen here. So for us, this is sufficient evidence to come up with a decision on the benefit risk. Of course, we are looking forward getting more data, and the company is running actually a clinical trial that will try also to measure the efficacy in terms of protection from COVID-19 in order to corroborate such conclusion.
Thank you very much. We now have a written question because the audio obviously is not working for Denise Roland from the Wall Street Journal, but now I need to look at the question. Okay, so her question is, the Commission warned a few weeks ago that without EMA's endorsement, Member States were taking on legal liability. How does EMA's recommendation change that? I can give that question to Dr. Sweeney.
So I think it's important to emphasise it's not for EMA to make a judgment on the liability, so really that question should be addressed to the European Commission. We've looked at the science, at the scientific data, and given our recommendations as has been published yesterday and described by Marco. Thank you.
Yes, thanks a lot. So, last question is a follow-up question from Helen Collis from Politico. Helen, please.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. I just wanted to follow up on the immunogenicity data. Was the increase in antibody levels do you see, for example, younger age groups seeing a greater increase in antibody levels than older age groups with the booster dose? Thank you.
Dr. Cavalieri?
I think overall we are seeing a pretty homogeneous increase of the antibodies in the different population. And just to remind you, the large study looking formally into the booster dose immunogenicity was restricted to 18-55 years of age. And we got extremely limited data, however, also in the elderly. And so these data are limited, and this fact will be reflected in the project information. But what we're seeing from this preliminary data in the elderly is that overall we don't see any significant difference in terms of the antibodies that have been elicited by the booster dose compared to the younger people. And this is not only about neutralization of the ancestral strain, so the original strain that is included in the vaccine, but also in terms of cross-neutralization to variants of concern such as the Delta.
Many thanks, Dr. Cavalieri. And this brings us to the end of today's press briefing. So thank you very much for attending and for your questions, and also a big thank you to my colleagues here at the panel, on the panel. Please remember that we are not going to hold a regular press briefing on Thursday because we did this today. But if you have any further questions, please contact, as always, our press office, press@ema.europa.eu. Thank you very much and have a good day. Bye-bye.